Welcome everyone. My name is Jordan Farmer. This is the Uncommon Ground YouTube channel where we are indoctrinating the masses. And today I'm going to be talking about the minimum wage, how to raise wages across the board, and the whole discussion surrounding the living wage. So to start off, the purpose of the minimum wage, in part, on one hand, it's a moral sort of claim about the world, and on another hand, it's an actual attempt at good policy. The moral claim is that life, and the whole discussion around a living wage and the minimum wage issues from a fundamental value of life. Then you say, because we trade life through labor for money, there's some inherent value to labor. And then you say the government should have some sort of policy that honors that. Then you come up to the point where you say you have this minimum wage, a floor on wages. And the moral claim is that labor is so valuable, to hire a man for less than a living wage is immoral. And then on the other hand, the policy prescription, or sort of attempted sort of reason behind it, is that if you raise the wages at the bottom for the least productive jobs, then the more productive jobs and employers will then have to raise their own wages to compete and maintain their better workers, and thus you have this sort of systemic raising of wages effect. A, it takes a while for that to happen. B, it doesn't work perfectly. And C, the minimum wage in its attempt to do this is a very blunt instrument with a lot of drawbacks, and it is not entirely effective or very effective very quickly at achieving all of these goals. We can have a floor on wages. We can honor life and labor in the system, in this sort of economic agreement between labor and capital. And in achieving the policies that I'm going to prescribe, we will actually create that sort of competition amongst laborers and their need to compete to maintain their quality workers and labor. Once you have that sort of, once you have the policies that I'm prescribing, that will ultimately create a floor on wages, and it will raise wages across the entire labor spectrum, which is much more effective and much quicker than the minimum wage. Real quick, some of the arguments that are false against the minimum wage. A is the idea that if you raise wages, that it increase the cost of goods, and then the cost of goods goes up proportionately or even disproportionately, and so overall society, things cost a lot more, and therefore we're materially more poor, we're worse off materially because of this increased input and labor input. Unfortunately, that's false for a couple of different reasons. One, the percentage of the cost of production is profit, labor, and some material cost of the goods and underlying cost of production that doesn't have anything to do with labor. The labor input, therefore, is never 100% of the cost of production. And so an increase in the labor inputs will not create a proportionate increase in the price or the cost of production. There will be a lagging effect. So if 50% of the cost of making a bag of chips is labor, you increase the input of labor by 50%, or it goes from being 50 cents of a dollar for a bag of chips to 75 cents of a dollar for a bag of chips. You have the sort of price of a dollar that's sort of its own competitive price, so profit will sort of give way to that. But you also, even if you just carried the cost on to the consumer, the labor inputs have increased by 50%, so the workers in that particular economy have more money by 50% to spend, but the cost of the good has only gone up 25% to $1.25. So, and it just stands to basic reason that if you went from paying people nothing to paying people something, and that increased cost of labor had this effect, then the entire system would fall apart, and you would not have economics at all. It just wouldn't work. You couldn't raise wages or anything. But it's all about first off, you have that sort of proportionate issue. Then you also have the productivity of the labor. That's a fluid idea. So there's a lot more that goes into it. But so the minimum wage critics are wrong for those reasons, but they're not wrong ultimately. Um, First, I'm going to just talk about how we achieve the goals of the minimum wage, and then I'm going to sort of break down why the minimum wage falls short of those goals. So, how do we raise wages systemically? There's two things that go into that. One is training / education / intragenerational or intergenerational skill building, which happens over time. And all that goes to investing in and developing human capital. If we have the talent if you have talent and you have the freedom to render those talents in the capitalist system, then wealth can be created. But if you have those skills, if you don't have those skills, it's not happening. You're not productive enough. You're not creating anything of value. And on the other hand, if you do have those skills, but you don't have the freedom to be able to make them actually to actually express them in real life, then you're also bad. So economic restrictions are bad, and then also having no skills is an issue. But that's one of the main contributing factors to the productivity of the society and to your productivity as a laborer and to your wages, is how much value you actually bring. That will determine how much someone can pay you, because if you cost more than you're actually producing, you're losing money for a business, and why would they hire you, especially if they can hire anyone else and they'll actually be more productive than their cost. So they're actually making the business money. So that's one side of it. And then the other side is the scarcity of labor. So if you have this human capital in this capacity, but there's 100 other guys right there outside the business that will take your job for less money and are just as good at you at doing that job, then your boss is either going to pay you that lower amount of money so that they keep you and all the personal sort of costs of firing you are avoided, but he's not missing out economically, or he hires one of them, fires you, and then he's got a cheaper laborer and he's just as productive. But if you have labor scarcity, which is very simply the number of jobs in a particular jurisdiction that are available exceed the number of employees or laborers that are available in that jurisdiction, and this can happen at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, and you want it ideally at all levels. Once you achieve that, then you have employers having to compete for employees, capitalists and owners having to compete for available labor. So you have poaching, where companies go and say, I'll pay you $2 more than you're making right now if you come work for me. And then you can bring that back to your employer and either make more money because the entire economy is doing well and your labor is of more value because it's more scarce, or he lets you go because you're not worth it to him. Maybe the other business is more efficient so they can pay people more because they make more value relative to their inputs and their cost of operation because they're more efficient for whatever reasons. So you have those two main factors going into it. And so we want to have good education, we want to have good training programs and cultivation of human capital, and we want to maintain labor scarcity, which all 100% has to do with the production in the economy, so the demand for labor, and then the available labor supply, or the labor pool, which has to do with how many children we're having, cost of living, and immigration, because obviously if you bring a bunch of extra labor in, you're increasing the supply. If you do that too fast, you're artificially creating an oversupply of labor. You create that first scenario and wages get pushed down. If you maintain labor scarcity, you create the second scenario, wages go up. But if you have sufficient, so there's degrees of labor scarcity, you can have 1 million more jobs than you need, or 10 more jobs than you need. If you get to a certain stage in labor scarcity, the goal of the minimum wage, being that floor on wages, can be achieved. In Utah, the cost of living is relatively low, the economic opportunities are pretty high, and the population's relatively low in proportion to that. So you have a certain state of labor scarcity that is achieved there, that is the youngest and least productive and least trained laborers, being 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds entering the labor market for the first time. They are able to get jobs that are well above the minimum wage in Utah. So the minimum wage was $8.25 an hour. Only thrift stores paid $9 an hour, and all other jobs, like there's a ton of fast food places and they were always hiring, and then a ton of smaller businesses and places that were always hiring. they all paid $10 an hour for those fast food places, and then any other kind of semi-skilled job beyond fast food would pay $12 an hour or more. And again, cost of living was lower on average there, although that was a shifting dynamic because of a mixture of policy and sort of national dynamics and population movements. So demand for housing and stuff is obvious. If you have increased demand for housing and a lagging response, then you have increases in the cost of housing that go up. And that's loosely related to property value, because you can obviously build up. So you can have multiple units of housing for the same property square footage. So property value can technically go up, but cost of housing cannot. It can balance out that way. Anywho, most of the people working the fast food places when I was there in Utah were these 16, 18-year-old kids that were that were working those jobs. So that's one degree of labor scarcity. That's sort of the ideal. And that creates a scenario where whenever you have any degree of labor scarcity, but especially a deep one, that permeates throughout the entire labor pool. So not just the lowest wages are raised, and then you have a secondary gradual effect, but all wages at all points throughout the labor spectrum are more valuable because you have general competition throughout the entire sphere, whereas so having labor scarcity not only can create a floor on wages, it grows wages across the board. And by making it so that labor is more valuable, the investment to make labor more productive relative to the value of labor gets in a better position. So companies paying to make their employees more productive or doing other things to try to help develop that focus or productivity or creativity or anything like that, or innovation, the climate is much better for all those things. And also, discrimination when you have labor scarcity is costly. You're paying more by not hiring. If you have an unlimited supply of employees, you can be discriminatory. But if you don't, and you actually have to hire people and you don't have very many options, you're not going to be as picky. And then that helps eat away first economically at that type of discrimination, and then ultimately culturally, because as you get more exposed to those people and you have better interactions, as the average material wealth of the lower class increases, you're going to have a whole lot more happy people, a lot more people that are much better off materially. And that, I think, that just carries over into obvious happiness and satisfaction and just quality of life once you hit a certain point with that. Labor scarcity also raises wages for the bottom tier the fastest, and then all tiers, depending on the individual labor scarcity within those markets. If you have a whole bunch of a certain type of worker and very few of another, obviously the very few of the other will be more valuable than the other one. So through labor scarcity, all the goals of the minimum wage can be achieved faster and more reliably. And through the cultivation of human capital, we will create a much more productive economy on a per capita basis. The living wage discussion is interesting because it's a completely subjective concept to a certain degree. First off, the cost of living influences what a living wage actually consists of, and when you have policies that artificially increase the cost of living, that creates hyperdependency, and that creates this much more urgent. It raises the wages that you have to get paid to be a living wage. On one hand, also the limiting 40-hour work week makes it so that you can only monetize your income a certain amount, and then if you go beyond that at one job, you have to start charging more and they have to pay more. That limits your ability to work a certain number of hours in a week. So the 40-hour work week is sort of an artificial limitation on your income. Cost of living is an artificial either limitation or burden on cost of living relative to that, and the relationship between the two, cost of living and income, is what influences this living wage. So to sort of advocate for a living wage from that fundamental values standpoint, saying labor has inherent value, so if you work a full job, you should be able to live off of that job, and there's something wrong about people paying you wages that can't pay the bills. I get all that, but the way we achieve that is through more sophisticated policies, and the minimum wage is a very blunt instrument in its attempts to do, in its attempts to achieve those goals. Lastly, the minimum wage basically raises the bottom rung on the economic ladder by saying if you can't produce enough value to be worth $15 an hour, not only will your job not exist, but if that industry doesn't have enough revenue and productivity to be able to afford the $15 an hour in laborers, let alone just like working themselves, that industry won't exist. So not only does it sort of raise the bottom rung of the economic ladder and say you must be this productive to ride the ride and to actually be able to make money, but also it makes it so that industries and certain types of jobs don't exist at all, which hurts labor scarcity. And if you have a situation where you have a recession and you can lower wages across the board for your employees, even if it goes below minimum wage for a period of time, you then hit and achieve labor scarcity faster. And so that mechanism kicks in sooner because you have more total jobs. And instead of firing people entirely, you can actually hire people or keep them on just for less money. This happens anyways, it just can't happen below the minimum wage, so they just fire those people because they're not productive enough to keep on within the given amount of revenue that they have to work with and the profit and all that kind of stuff. Also, and lastly, I want to talk about the relationship between the economy and welfare and the way we sort of operate. Right now, you get a lot more out of welfare if you are in a bad situation, and then as you work your way out of it, those resources go away faster than they come, and so a lot of people are incentivized to remain in that bottom tier. They're materially better off if they don't go and get that job that they could go and hustle and hypothetically get. If you switch to a UBI system where you actually can solve poverty, this is the only way you solve poverty, because although everyone has a unique creative and productive capacity, and our society should be designed in such a way, or at least the conditions should be such that you can not only express your creative and productive capacity freely, but to the degree that you can monetize it, that you should be free to monetize it to whatever degree you feel like. Not everyone's creative and productive capacity, not everyone's labor is ever going to be monetizable enough to cover cost of living. Even if you lower cost of living, even if you hit all these factors, a blind, deaf, schizophrenic crack baby is not going to be able to go out there and hustle and pull itself up by its bootstraps and go get a job and pay the bills without a whole lot of assistance on the front end. And that person should get that assistance, A, and B. If they're never going to be able to make it, they should still be encouraged to express and participate and be economically online. And they know, A, their income will never, well, they know that their income will never go below that $12,000. But also, a lot of people would plan their cost of living around that $12,000 per individual, or when you have a two-parent household or just two adults in a house, 2 or 3, if you have 3, you bring your mom-in-law or whatever, mother-in-law, you end up with, $3,000 per person if it's $1,000 a person. You get more adults, more potential parenting investment. You get more money from the government under those conditions as opposed to when you have less. So not only on that front, but also on the front of planning your cost of living if you lose your job and the things go sour, but also people will be in a position where they know they're getting that help from the government and they have that minimum level of resources to work with. It's not a minimum wage or it's a minimum amount of resources to work with. If they work at all, even a little bit, they have more resources and more material wealth and money than they had before. So they're incentivized from the jump positively to help their lives. And so the positive motivations of the brain are still activated in that particular scenario. But the negative and very, very stressful side of economic poverty and disaster and pain, that is cushioned by that $1,000 a month, But that's not A, enough to really build wealth off of, and B, that's not enough to really live off of particularly comfortably. So you're going to want to work and monetize yourself as much as you can. But, oh, so, and the UBI will facilitate that, and it's good for a bunch of different reasons. Also, it will structure and create stable. It would make, sorry, I can talk, I promise. It would make very stable the costs of that welfare. Right now, when the economy's good and labor scarcity's in good effect, and you have very little unemployment, the costs of the welfare are down, and the revenue on the tax end is high and up. But then as soon as you have an economic crash, the tax revenue goes down, but then the costs of unemployment and welfare go up. So it's kind of built into the system that we're going to ride those waves through debt. And unfortunately, when you have enough bad policy over time, you end up with more debt creation than debt dissolution, or the more you don't pay off enough. So for many reasons, our current welfare system is dysfunctional, and it negatively influences the economy and all sorts of things. I'm against the minimum wage just because I think it's a very blunt instrument for something that, if you create the right conditions in the economy, is no longer a problem. The floor in the wage issue is taken care of. Wages being raised across the board is being taken care of. If you decrease cost of living and decrease the bad conditions around labor, you really can achieve something special and materially make people better off and achieve all the goals that we want economically without any of the drawbacks. I hope this was clear enough. I hope this illuminated the minimum wage, living wage, and raising wages sort of debate. And I hope that we can ultimately implement these policies and see our economy and our people and our peace and prosperity and America as a system fully expressed, and let our might shine. Right now, there's so many bad policies holding us down that the fact that we're as productive as we are is a testament to the American people and to our system and the strength of it. But we could be magnitudes more than we are now with the right policies and with some time. So like, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a good day. Let's level up our political understanding. Peace.